mislead you in any way. This is exactly what you're going to have to do next week. So if you are comprehending it right now, it's going to look easy. Because as far as I said, I do not intend, and I'm going to stand by my word, I do not intend to make a single change in the wording of the problems. The only change will be the number. Besides, the number is not changing.
Come on.
If you tattooed on your arm, you can't take it off.
There are two choices. One choice is for me to change the problems and give you access to this one. And I'm telling you, this is going to be much harder than this, the other option. Keep things the way they are, and you have to study on your own. So no, it's unfortunately you can have it both ways. So, no access to.
May I have some of that yellow chicken?
Oh, did I send it the last
Huh?
Any program?
No, I remember bits and pieces. I
Actually, I remember.
Yeah, she's very emotional right now.
David, I don't think I have your number.
305 979 9316.
1 sec.
9316.
1 sex.
I recommend sending me text messages.
Yeah, he's not that great picking up his phone.
Okay, I know you're tired, but let's get it going so we have only 1 hour left. So let's get going so we can finish on time. Eh?
20 minutes.
No, we're not going to do it. Okay,
He said,
here.
no, we're not going to do it.
Okay, we're going all the way towards the front here, so we're down to 2 problems. Let me start with the second one, personnel scheduling, and then I'll leave the resource allocation for last. So for personnel scheduling, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a version of the problem that is a little bit smaller. So remember last time I said I gave you a problem where we had 8-hour shifts, and we had 4-hour intervals. So I'm going to make the problem smaller on the exam. So we can have 12-hour shifts with demand changing every 6 hours. So that's the one I'm planning to ask you, and I'm going to put it on the board right now.
Thank you.
So let's assume that we have a situation. Again, we're talking about departments that operate 24/7. And I gave you examples. Police departments, fire departments, ER departments in hospitals. And let's assume that the demand is given on a 6-hour interval. So let's take starting at 6 a.m. So from 6 a.m. to 12 noon, we need at least 25 employees. So let's say now from 12 noon to 6 p.m., we go down significantly. We only need 12 employees working. At least. That means in this interval, we can have 12 or more. At least means that's a minimum number. We need at least 12. We can have more, but we cannot have fewer. 6 p.m. to 12 midnight.
Yeah.
Let's go up. 18. And then 12 midnight. 6 a.m. 22. Okay, so what else? What other information I'm going to give you? The other information that I'm going to give you is, if you are the manager, the manager of these facilities, what are the options you have? There is one requirement that each employee must work. Now I'm going to make it 12. Because since I go to 6, I want it to be a multiple of 6. So I'll go to 12. Each employee
This is Eddie's problem.
must work 12 consecutive hours.
Wow, are we in China?
No, it's a 3-day work, 36 hours.
Yeah, in some departments, even that is realistic. Because especially in emergency situations, police departments go to 12-hour shifts. So it's not unheard of, 12-hour shifts. Of course, how do they make up for the extra time? More days off. So when somebody has to work 12-hour
I pay
shifts,
people to do
they
that.
get
That
3
works.
days or 4 days a week off. That's how
Maybe
it
not to
works.
work.
So each employee must work 12 consecutive hours. So I will help you more to tell you what are the options. The options is to have a group X1 working from when? Starting from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. So that's one group. I mean, what are the options? Of course, we can ask somebody to come at 6 a.m. But look at the requirement: 12 consecutive hours. So if a group starts working at 6 a.m., for how long are they going to be going? Until 6 p.m. what is the next break here? The next break is 12 noon. So we can have another group, let's call them number 2, start at 12 noon, and they're going to go until 12 midnight. I'll give you this. I'll say, here are the options.
Okay.
I'll give you, here are the options. So this way you don't have to try to work around what are my options. So I will list on the exam the options. So as a manager, you have the option to ask people to come to work at 6 a.m. Those people will work until 6 p.m. Another option is to ask people to come to work, group number 2. The first one I called it X1, group number 1. The second group, I call it group number 2. You have the option to ask people to come to work at noon. So those people are going to work until what? Midnight. Because now the shifts are 12-hour long. Third option. Third option is to ask people to come to work, group number 3. 6 p.m. They're going to go until 6 a.m. And fourth and final option, you ask a group to come to work at midnight, and this group is going to go until 12 noon the next day. So you see, why did I say this problem is smaller? Because we had 6 variables in the previous problem.
Right.
Now we're down to 4. But as far as the structure of the problem is pretty much the same structure, but it's smaller. So there are 2 versions of this problem. The first question will be to formulate. But let me put wages. So I want to give you the version of the problem in which the objective is to minimize payroll cost. So let's give hourly wages. The hourly wages are $10 per hour for each hour between 6 a.m. and 12 midnight. And let's double it. $20 per hour.
Oh, I want that shit.
For each hour. Okay, so now the question. I'm going to ask 2 questions, but I'm not going to ask both of them at the same time. The first one is formulation, so we'll do that part first, and then we'll continue with the second part, which is to figure out how much slack, redundancy we have. So the first question is formulate as a linear program if the objective is to minimize total daily payroll. I will do part of it right now, but the other part I want you to work a little bit on it to do it yourselves before I finish it. When we talk about formulating, when we're talking about formulating a linear program, we have 3 steps. Let me repeat the steps because that was a long time ago. So the 3 steps we have is the first step is to identify what is the objective. The objective usually is given in words, so we have to convert it. Here it is, in words, to minimize total daily payroll. Of course, we have to convert it to a mathematical expression. But right now we can identify the objective is to minimize total daily payroll. What is the second step? Identify the options, variables. So what are our options, variables in this case? Also given. In this problem, I'll give them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here are the options. Number of people working the first shift, the second, etc. So we have the options. The third part is to do the constraints and write the objective as a function of the variables. Write the objective in a mathematical form. So I would like you to work on that yourselves for a few minutes, but let me write the constraints right now to understand how it works. In this problem, we said the constraints are to ensure that we have enough people in each time interval. So what is the first interval that we have? 6 a.m. to 12 noon. During that time, we need at least, look at what it says there, at least 25 people. So which groups are working between 6 a.m. to noon? Is this group working, the first group? Yes. And if you check, it's the last one also. It's 1 and 4.
No, it's 1 and 2.
Okay, 6 a.m. to noon. The second group, look at, they start at noon. So they don't work from 6 a.m. to noon. Look at, they start here. No, No to this one. If you go to that one, the answer is yes. Because look at, they work from midnight to noon. So 6 a.m. to noon, it's part of their shift. So it's group 1 and 4 together.
So that's the constraint?
That will give us for each interval, each time interval here generates a constraint, needs a constraint. So the constraint to satisfy this requirement that we need 25 people between 6 a.m. and noon, we have to figure out of those groups, which groups are working from 6 a.m. to noon. Hint, there will always be with this problem 2 groups at a time. In each case, there will be 2 consecutive 2 groups. So for the first one, is for from 6 a.m. to noon, is 6 a.m. to noon part of the shift of group 1? Yes. Is it part of the shift of group 2? No. Group 3? No. Group 4? Yes. So it's 1 and 4. So 1 and 4 together, let me write it here. 1 and 4 together must be at least 25. So that is taking care of this constraint. So we have the constraint for this time interval. So for each time interval, I match it with the shifts. And it usually matches with 2 shifts. Let me show you one more time. Let me show you the next one. Noon to 6 p.m. Who is working between noon and 6 p.m.? Is group number 1 working? Yes.
Yes.
Noon to 6 p.m. is part of their shift. Is group 2 working? Yes. Noon to 6 p.m. is part of the shift. Is noon to 6 p.m. part of 3? No. It doesn't. It misses it. No here. So it's 1 and 2. So 1 and 2 together, we're working between noon and 6 p.m. together, combined, must be how many of them? At least 12. So 1 and 2, 1 plus 2, must be at least 12. One plus 2, 12. Again, I'll do it 2 more times so you see how it works. Next interval, next times, when I say interval, time window, you can call it anything you want, time window. 6 p.m. to midnight. So who is working from 6 p.m. to midnight? First group? No. Second group? Yes. Third group? Yes. Fourth one? No. Now it's a pattern. I also told you when we did it for the first time that it's a pattern. It's always 1 out, the next one in. So the next one will be 1 out, the next one will be 2 and 3. So you can verify it's 2 and 3. Groups 2 and 3 together, combined, we need how many people working? At least 18. And last one is midnight to 6 a.m. So let's see who's working. Midnight to 6 a.m. is part of 3 and 4. Greater or equal? 22. Okay, so what other constraints do you need in this problem? You need to make sure that xi is greater or equal than 0. I is 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't want to write it 4 times. x1 greater or equal than 0. x2 greater or equal than 0. x3 greater or equal, each one of them is greater or equal than 0. And also xi equal integer. That means each one of them, x1, x2, I is 1, 2, 3, 4. Exactly, because since we're dealing with individuals, we cannot allow fractional numbers.
So we can just put xi, is fine?
Yeah, if you put xi, it's fine. So what is missing here? What I want you to spend a few minutes, write me the objective function. The objective function is to minimize an expression. The amount of money we pay each person in group 1 times x1, plus the amount of money we pay each person in group 2 times x2. So what you need to do, spend a few minutes to do it on your own. How much money do we pay each employee working in group 1? How much money we pay each employee working in group 2? How much money we pay each employee working in group 3? And how much money we pay each employee working in group 4? If you get those 4 numbers, then I can write the objective function. So what I want from you to do, spend a few minutes and answer those 4 questions. Amount of money per day that we pay each individual in group 1. Then the same answer, the same similar number for groups 2, 3, and 4. So spend a few minutes to do that. You need to factor in those two numbers, obviously. The answer is based on those two numbers. You have to factor in those two numbers.
You have to like some hours will fall between 6 a.m. and 12 midnight, so you multiply that by 10, and then the other one will fall between 12 midnight and 6 a.m.
Yeah.
So it'll be 6 times 10 and then 6 times 1. And you add. So here, they're telling you that people get paid differently. So it's 10 hours. $10 an hour if you work from 6 a.m. to 12 midnight. So you have to look at the shift.
I was right, dude.
From 6 a.m. to 6 p.m.
I had 10. You put 15, so I gave 10. 15. Alex, 2. No, this one. You had 15. I was like, oh shit, I went too wrong.
Here, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. 6 a.m. to 12 12 hours shift. So you multiply 12 hours.
It's the one where I walked in late.
So that's 1 hour. But this one falls 12 p.m. So you still fall in
The extra.
you still get paid 120. This one, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. After
Is this half and half? Because half the shift is 10, the other half is 20.
12.
So how you split it?
You add both and divide by 2.
Wow.
The thing about it is, 1 hour is before 12, say $20. The hour after is $10. When you work both hours, how much you make? $30. Or 15 times 2.
So for example, look, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. So 6 p.m. you're coming in at $10 an hour. You start at 6 p.m.
Yeah, half the shift is half. Well, you know what?
So you can do an average?
Sometimes I gotta slow them down, but I gotta slow them down.
I remember I did that. Okay.
Because you're working half and half, like having 10 and having 12.
I'm only counting 1 hour, you gotta count the whole shift. So that's 10 times, so the first shift, sorry, 12 hours, right?
It's the
6
same
hours,
thing.
$60
Right.
plus. So
120. It's 180.
12 to 6 a.m. to 12 p.m. That's 12 hours. That's 120.
So 60 is 180.
And then 12 noon to 12 midnight, that's half and half. So it's 60 plus 80 is 140. Right?
Huh?
60 plus 80
Yes.
is 140. Okay,
Yes.
thanks very much.
Yeah, but
6, that's 120 for the whole shift. Noon, 6, 60.
and the rest will be
80,
later.
that's 140.
I'm just gonna wait.
That's 140. So 6 p.m. The first 6, so the X3
Yeah,
is
because then
140.
I'm not gonna
Y
understand.
next one is
Y is xi less than or equal to y0.
It can be 0. Eddie,
It has to be 0?
x1 x1 times 120,
No, but I'm
x2
saying, but
times
where's that 0
140,
come from?
x3
What's
times
xi?
140, x4 times 120,
So all of this, 1, 2, 3, 4.
60, 180.
Okay, let me do it now. You have enough time to look at it?
Yes, yes, continue.
Okay, let's
Oh,
take
okay, I was
the
doing
fir-
4.
Okay.
Okay.
The question on the board is okay, even if you're not finished, now you need to pay attention to see that it's not just a number, it's the steps that I follow to get there. So let's take this group, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. 12 hours, each one of these groups is a 12-hour shift, but we have to figure out at which rate they get paid. So this one is 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. is daytime, the whole thing. So it's paid at 10. Remember what is the policy of the department? Daytime is defined from 6 a.m. to midnight. So from 6 a.m. to midnight is $10 per hour.
Only.
So this group is working 12 hours daytime, let's call it. All of them paid at 10. So each individual is getting paid 10 times 12, 120. So the charge, the daily wage for each person working in the first group is 120. 12 hours, each one of them at 10.
Oh, 12
Let's take
times
this
10
group.
equals 20. Okay.
Noon to midnight, still, it's the same thing. There is no what we call the graveyard shift. This one ends just before it starts. All 12 hours are getting compensated at 10. So each individual in this group is getting compensated $10 per hour for 12 hours, 10 times 112, 10 times 12, 120. This one is tricky. Okay, let me say why it's tricky. So let's put it, it's from 6 p.m., somewhere in the middle is midnight, and it ends at 6 a.m. So what I did is, I put it on a straight line. So half of the shift, the compensation rate for half of the shift between 6 p.m. to midnight is 10. But for the other half of the shift, from midnight to 6 a.m., is the graveyard shift. So the department is paying according to this 20. So what is the daily payroll for this individual? 10 times 6 plus 20 times 6, 180.
What? Say it again?
180.
What do you multiply?
Because there's 12 hours in
6
shift.
hours at $10 and 6 hours.
Oh,
So
6
this one is
times 10.
180.
That's
Because
okay.
look, that's the reason I drew the
12
line.
hour shift.
Half
So
the
6
shift
times 10.
The first
is
half,
paid is
it's
getting
6
paid
times-
at 10.
and the other half is
But
6
the other half
And
is
you add
getting
one.
paid at what? At 20. So it breaks.
That's what it's doing.
Okay, let me do the last. The last one is similar. The last one is also similar. So let me do the last one. So the last one is midnight to 12 noon. If midnight is here, it starts at 12 midnight, the last one, ends at 12 noon. So 6 a.m. is somewhere in the middle.
Right.
So the same story, but the other way around. The first 6 hours qualify for 20. The last 6 for 10. So the total again, 20 times 6 plus 10 times 6, 180. So 180 for each individual working here. So let's put now I can write the objective. What is the total daily payroll cost for this department? Whoever works in group 1, each one of them is making 120. So I just figure the numbers, 120, 120, 180, 180. So whoever is working in the first group is 120. We don't know how many, we just know how we define it as X1. So the cost is 120 each times how many we have, X1. Plus the next group, what is the cost? 120 per person times how many of them? At this point we don't know, we just put X2. We don't know how many of them are there. Plus group number 3, X3 of them at 180 each. Plus 180 times X3.
Plus, again,
Plus group number 4 at
180 times A4.
So now we're done. So this problem is, that's the complete formulation. This is the objective function, and these are the constraints. So now the problem is complete. We have the objective function, and we also have the constraints. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, is to give you the second part of this. That's all you need to know. So the complete formulation is objective function up there, the one that I put in a box, and the constraints which I had already written. The constraints, no, I'm not going to give you, let me understand what I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you this part, definition of the variables, but you have to come up with this one. So this one you have to come up with. Those are the constraints that you have to come up with, and those two, of course.
But the constraints you just get, and you give us that, right?
I'll give you that. Okay, let's understand what is the sequence of steps. This is the definition of variables. Technically, you have to come up with it, but in this case, I'm going to make an exception and give it to you. So I'll give you the variables. Then what you are responsible for is to write the formulation. What constitutes a formulation? 2 steps. An objective function, so you have to write this expression, and the constraints. The constraints is this group and this group, all of them together. So what I'm doing here, in addition to the standard formulation that we did in class, is instead of expecting you to define the variables, I am going to define the variables myself, x1, x2, x3, x4.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to define the variables
Why that
myself,
always gonna
so
be
there is no confusion. So I'm going to give you this part. But given this part, you have to come up with the objective function. So what is in the box here is the objective function. And what is down there are the constraints. Now, the second part of the problem. Assuming I will give you a solution. So I said, of course, I don't want to spend time now in Excel. I'll give you a fictitious one. But technically, I have to go to Excel and figure out the solution. There is no time for it now. So I'll give you a fictitious one. Assume that we get a solution. x1 equals 20, x2 equals, let's say, it's here. x2 equals 0, x3 equals 18, and x4 5. So I just made up a solution. So assume that we have a solution. So I'm going to ask you how many. Let me write it here.
You want us to plug in the numbers?
No, let's use these numbers. That's fine. So the question, I'm going to write a question. How many extra man hours do we have? Or redundant, if you want. I'll decide which word, but both of them. I'll show you how this is done. So remember what we said. The reason that we need to know the additional or redundant man hours is that that information in practice is very useful to reallocate employees from this unit to another unit. So if this is the solution, then how do we answer this question? So we say, let's go back to the constraints. Let's take the constraints one by one. Let's take the first constraint.
Professor, I'm sorry, I was discussing a problem and I'm lost. Where are you right now?
I finished the first part, which was the formulation. Then I said, follow-up question. I said, assume that going into Excel, this is the solution. Let's put here Excel solution. If this is the solution, how many man hours do we have per day? I'll explain what do I mean, how many additional man hours do we have per day. I'll explain this in a minute. So, when we get the solution, we go in these constraints and we say, now we know what is the value of 1, what is the value of 4. So let's go in the constraints and substitute for 1, 2, 3, 4 the actual numbers. So let's substitute the actual numbers. That will give us the hint to figure out how much excess do we have. So let's take the first constraint. The first constraint, if we substitute 1 is equal to what? 20. And 4 is equal to 5. So the first constraint, in the first constraint, 1 is 20. Where am I reading this? From there. The solution will be given. 1 is 20 and 4 is 5. So if we use 20 here and 5, the first constraint becomes 25, which of course is equal to 25. So this becomes 25 equal to 25. Let's do the same here, 1 and 2. 1 and 2 is 20 plus 0. So the second constraint becomes 20 plus 0, 20, which of course is greater than 12. Let's go to 3. Constraint 3 is what? 2 plus 3, greater or equal than 18. How much is 2 plus 3 now?
18.
0 plus 18. 18 equal 18. The last one, 3 plus 4. 18 plus 5, 23. Becomes 23, greater than 22. Okay, when a solution is given, what is the first step? The first step is to take the solution values and put it in the constraints. What's going to happen? In some constraints, we get a match, equal. In this case, in which constraints we get a match? First one and third one. Let's recall, I know it was a long time ago. So this, does anybody remember
Binding.
the terms? Binding. Those two are binding constraints. So for those two constraints, there is no excess. It's binding. That means from a managerial standpoint, that's perfect. That means we have exactly, remember we said at least we have exactly what we need. We don't have any redundancy. So for those two constraints, there is no redundancy. That means the actual solution gave us exactly the same number of employees that we need. No redundancy. So those two constraints are binding. There is no redundancy. Now the other, what happens in the second constraint? How much redundancy do we have? How many people?
8.
8. The difference, of course. So the redundancy, the extra is 8 persons, 8 men, let's assume it's men. But for how long is each one of them being redundant? What is the length of this constraint? For this constraint, how many hours does it represent? Okay, let's go back here instead of guessing. This constraint was generated by this restriction from 12 noon to 6 p.m. So how long is that interval? 6 hours. So that's how we work. We say this constraint represents the time from between noon and 6 p.m. How long is the interval? How many hours is between noon and 6 p.m.? How many? 6. So how many additional man hours this constraint is generating? It's generating, 6 hours times 8. Remember how many man hours? So it's 8 extra men for how long? 6 hours. So how much redundancy is this constraint generating? 8 times 6. 48. We don't have to worry about it because it's matching 0. There is nothing there. Last one. X3 plus 4 greater or equal to 22. Where is this coming from? From this restriction. So this 22 represents the time interval from midnight to 6 a.m. How long is that interval from midnight to 6 a.m.? How long? Just how long? Just tell me.
6 hours.
6 hours. Okay, same thing. 6 hours. I mean, it's not a trick question. It's the same. It's 6 hours. So how much redundancy we have here? How many?
6.
As far as number of people, 1 person.
6.
For how long? 6 again. 1 times 6 equals 6. So the total, 48 plus 6.
54.
60. 54. Here is the answer.
54.
So that solution is generating an additional, and it is generating slack, or is generating redundancy equal to 54 man hours. There are many terms. This can be called slack, this can be called redundancy, this can be called excess. So how do we determine? What you need to know is how we compute it. What you need to know how this value is computed. So this value is computed as follows. We take the solution, I repeat the steps. The first is we take the solution and we put the solution back in the constraints. Remember what I said. Can all of them be non-binding? No. If all of them is non-binding, that means we have too many people. At least one of them will be equal. In this case, 2 of them happen to be equal.
So how will we answer this? That the proper statement we have to use?
The proper statement is that the excess is equal to 54 man hours.
Okay, the excess?
Excess or redundancy is equal to 54 man hours. But I want to tell you one more time how I did it. It's more important to know how I did it. So the way I did it is the following. So I went to each constraint, and I plugged in the solution. And then I put the solution against the limit. And when there is a matching value, there is no redundancy. But when there is excess, the difference is how many extra employees I have. Since each one of those constraints represents one of those intervals, and each one of those intervals is 6 hours long, so how much excess do I have? The number of people which are in excess times 6, 48 man hours. And the last one person times 6 man hours. Total per day, 48 plus 6, 54. So this is the type of information that is needed in real life, because again, those departments, as I said, are not standalone departments. So the supervisors communicate to each other. So this supervisor can say, I have 8 extra people. What is the second interval? From noon to 6 p.m. So from noon to 6 p.m., I have 8 extra people. I can let you use them next door. So that's the reason we need to have this information. Yes?
We just say we have 54
Redundant excess is a good word. Not redundant, excess. Excess. Per day, yes. We have a total of 54 man hours per day excess. But more specifically, not only we know how many, we know also when. 8 extra people from noon. Look at the second. 8 extra. Not only we know how many, but also we know when we have them. 8 extra from noon to 6 p.m. and 1 extra from midnight to 6 a.m. So not only we know how many, but we know when. Yes?
Okay, so the 54 is the excess manpower that we have per
Man
day.
hours. Let's call it man hours.
Yeah, we have per day.
Yes.
But your question was how many manpower do we have per
Not
day?
power. If I put power, I made a mistake. It's man hours. Let me see what.
Yeah, you said man hours. You can say man hours.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I meant. How many extra man hours per day do I have? And the answer is 54.
Okay.
But I'm elaborating on it. Not only we know it's 54, we know when do we have them. I said 8 of them are in the first 6 hours between noon and 6 p.m. And the other 8 is at the bottom, midnight. And 1 at the bottom, midnight to 6 a.m. Okay, so we're almost there. We'll do one problem from resource allocation, and we're done.
Thank you, Jesus.
Yes, plans.
They told you this one.
What if I give it with this exactly the same thing without